Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
Foundations.
The measure for measure of how God has responded to us, we should be responding to others. Not always looking for, well, you're suffering because of this, or you're suffering because you sinned, or you're suffering because of... Sometimes life just is nasty.
Foundations. Understanding the Jewish foundations of our Christian faith. With Robbo Robinson and Mandy Warby.
On our last program, we were looking at judging from a slightly different angle as we have done in the past, looking at Jewish logic and understanding measure for measure. Now, on our last program, we spoke about what measure for measure is, and today we're going to look at the other side of it, what measure for measure is not.
Yeah, well, there's a right way to understand this measure for measure, this Jewish logic, which is midah keneged midah. We did see that this measurement is in general terms of sowing and reaping. Some would say karma. And you can see it in people's lives who have a characteristic of being gracious and merciful and kind. They receive that back in extraordinary ways. And the reverse is true as well. People who tend to be vitriolic, who are poisonous with their words, who tend to be cruel, they seem to live in that perpetually. As they're giving it out, it's coming back. And I mentioned just very briefly in the last program that you see that in the gang culture. As an extreme example, they live by the sword and they're dying by the sword, and it's horrible for them. But then, so if you're living with that understanding, then you could adversely think, well, and anything that happens to you or I in our lives is measure for measure, and God is doling out this justice on us because therefore we deserve it. That's going too far the other way.
It almost becomes to the superstitious level where everything is a cause and effect sort of moment. Every situation that happens, there must have been a reason for that. I'm reaping something I've sown yesterday or last week or last year. Yeah,
and that's not right either, because, we were told as believers that we would suffer persecution, that there would be hardship, that we would have trials and tribulations, and that those things were actually part of God's plan and purpose for us because they develop such good things in us. We don't like them. They're not a nice experience, but God uses them to refine us. So not everything that happens that is negative to us is because suddenly we're being brought under this measure for measure understanding and that we're getting our just desserts. No, that's just part of life. We're talking about these habitual, contrary kind of natures or behaviours that are in us that over time we're going to reap those things, good and bad. Proverbs 21:13 says, "He who shuts his ear to the cry of the poor will also cry himself and not be answered." And so with this Jewish logic in mind of measure for measure, it's not just about the things that we do or these habitual characteristics that we're going to start reaping in same measure. It's also the things that we don't do when we have that capacity and see God is watching. And there was an 18th century rabbi, and he described it this way. He said, when a poor man asks you for aid, don't use his faults as an excuse for not helping him, for then God will look at your offences and he's sure to find many. And so in that regard, it's very easy when we look at somebody who's in a really difficult situation and we can say, well, they got themselves into that mess. So therefore, let's just leave them to it and maybe they'll learn a lesson. The question from this particular Jewish logic of measure for measure is, how would we feel if that was God's attitude toward us? Because we got ourselves into a mess, a right old mess of sin, and we didn't actually deserve or have the right to demand that God get us out of the mess, and yet he did. And so measure for measure, if we respond to another person who themselves is in a great deal of need, whether it be of their own making or not, by responding from a heart of mercy, we are mimicking measure by measure, midah keneged midah, the same way that God extended that to us. And therefore we're reflecting him.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's one of his attributes, isn't it? Mercy. And so, as you say, as we act in a merciful way, God will reward us for that measure for measure.
Absolutely. But we're peculiar people, really, in that after we've been saved a little bit and God starts to knock off some of these bad behaviours and attitudes, another attitude develops, and that is that we start to think we're pretty hot stuff and that we're pretty good and that we're a little bit better than some others. And just because I've had to go through something and learn something, well, they do too. But that's not a reflection of the mercy that Christ has given us. There are times actually where somebody who just keeps doing the same thing and they're getting themselves into trouble. And there are times when you have to kind of say, you know what, I'm actually not helping this person by constantly getting him out of this. That is an act of love when you say, I'm not going to fix this anymore. I'm going to be here for you, but you're going to have to make some changes so you get out of this behaviour. That's different. We're talking about in a generic sense when somebody's in need, even if it's of their own making, that to extend mercy to them and help them is a reflection of the mercy that Christ has given us, measure for measure, when we didn't deserve it. And then there's those times when, you think, wow, these terrible things have happened to this person. Maybe this is God raining judgment on somebody. And there was an occasion in Luke 13, verses 2 to 5, where the disciples were asking Jesus, the Galileans, that got slaughtered and they suffered. Was that because of some sin? And Jesus responded by saying, do you think these Galileans were worse sinners than all other Galileans because they suffered that way? He says, I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you too will all perish. And then he goes on to talk about some other people who suffered terribly. There are times when we reap what we sow, but then there are times when life just happens. And still, we are required to respond measure for measure, not by the measure for measure of human standards, but again, to reinforce what we were just talking about, the measure for measure of how God has responded to us, we should be responding to others, not always looking for, well, you're suffering because of this, or you're suffering because you sinned, or you're suffering because of... Sometimes life just is nasty. And let's extend mercy the way Christ has. There's another thing with Jewish logic. When you think about the Jewish people as an example, and I just want to finish, there's more in the notes actually, but I just want to finish with this. During the Second World War, when it got to the very end of the Second World War and the Allies were approaching a lot of the death camps, the Nazis were told to leave and to take the Jewish prisoners with them. And the goal was just kill them. And so what they did was they went on the death marches, and they literally, in the snow, in the freezing cold, no food, no proper clothing, no, they were literally marched and marched and marched until these Jews literally dropped and died on the side of the road. Well, in recent years, an event takes place every year in Europe called the March for Life, where survivors, their ancestors and the ancestors of Nazis are walking together, marching the same death march route, and there's this forgiveness where these Nazi descendants have said, I am so ashamed that my father or grandfather or my uncle or my great-grandfather, whoever it was, participated in the slaughter of Jews in this way, and we're so sorry, please forgive us. And the response of the Jewish people has been, and it's hard for them, but the response has been, we forgive you. You didn't actually do it, but we forgive you. They embrace. They become lifelong friends. Now, that is measure for measure. And these are Jewish people who actually don't know Christ. Okay, they're unbelieving Jews in that sense. But they are still actually reflecting this measure for measure extension of mercy and grace. As a consequence, the blessing that is on the nation of Israel, in spite of their unbelief, is demonstrated in this sowing and reaping, this measure for measure. The Jewish people are a light to the nations, even in their unbelief, and we can learn a lot from them. And this is because of this Jewish logic that has been taught to them throughout the centuries.
As mentioned, there is more you can read about on the notes, and we encourage you to download those from the website. But on the next program, we're going to go back to the beginning, back to Genesis, to investigate the sagas and dramas detailed there.
This has been Foundations, a look at the Jewish foundations of our Christian faith. For study notes, resources and more, see vision.org.au/foundations.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.